what I want to do here, I just want to, before we progress, I want to fully acknowledge the founding fathers of psychological thought, the founders of the nature debate and the founders of the nurture debate, and show you, hopefully, before we really start unpacking the schools of thought, how they all interconnect, right? Where they all fit in a grander perspective. This can give us a good understanding of the extent of the human experience, and thus therefore then allow us to identify the aspects of the human experience that we perhaps might be more interested in. Remember, some of them, although they in some contexts fit into the realms of psychological thought, I'm going to suggest that they don't, but please allow me to explain. So, we have the nature debate, we have the nurture debate. The nature debate founds itself on a basis of structuralism. Structuralism, for the purpose of studying the conscious, right? Consciousness. We understand that human beings have experience, and if we can study enough human beings and their experiences as structuralists, as psychological observers, then we might be able to categorize and package up the human experience and thus explain human behavior in a structuralist way. But I'm guessing that looking in a generalized direction doesn't allow us to appreciate individual perspective or experience. So we're here now looking at quantitative data, or we're looking at qualitative data. I'm guessing the only data that's relevant to you is qualitative data, because when it comes to understanding your life, you want people who are going to take time to ask you questions for the purpose of understanding you. It's certainly not helpful being categorized or having labels assigned onto us because of observations that have been made on others, right? This does kind of spawn the personality theory. We have had over the last few hundred years men and women who've developed all sorts of personality theories, all seeking to define the human identity. Right, let's think about Soren Kierkegaard's works. Strive to be who one is. All right, we must strive to be who we are in life, otherwise we're going to end up in this place of despair. But we certainly aren't going to grow an awareness of who we are on an identity level if we're just simply looking at personality traits. Personality traits are certainly different from traits of virtue, character traits. All right, so let's just be aware of this before we continue. So, functionalism studies how consciousness changes according to our environment. All right, so structuralist view, consciousness just is. We just want to understand the components of consciousness for the purpose of explaining human behavior. Here, functionalism, we want to explore individual perspective for the purpose of understanding how it is that individuals respond to their environments. All right. Two different angles here. So, let's look at how the 7 main schools of thought fit into this nature-nurture debate. I'm going to touch on most of the schools, but I am not going to delve into the biological school of thought, because I won't be the only person in the world who says this. However, there are some schools of thought and some individuals who will disagree with me. The biological school of thought focuses on the outworkings of the human brain. We're here as psychologists, as modern applied psychologists, to understand the outworkings and the complexities of the mind, why we do what we do. All right? Granted, we can be structured however we are structured, but this does not explain or give us any insight into the reasons why. Okay? Even the evolutionary school of thought, man comes from monkeys. Granted, this is a very, very primal idea, but this one idea is pointing us in a slightly more helpful direction. All right, either just change happens onto us, we're helpless victims of circumstance that can do nothing about change, or we are in control of the process and we can determine the choices that we make in life, which then therefore means that we are each responsible for our habitual patterns of behavior, which means it doesn't really matter what a person does in life. Everyone can learn to respond or react to life in a certain way, and also then change when one's desire to change becomes greater than one's desire to remain the same. All right, okay, big ideas. So the evolutionary school of thought evolves and spawns out of the biological school of thought, but it is separate and it is apart from. This focuses solely on the mind. This focuses on how we evolve and how we have evolved as a species. But from here, we're then going to go back to how it is that we develop and grow. We're going to look at how we learn, how it is that we evolve. Then we are going to explore the Freudian perspective. Why? Because it just has to fit in somewhere in the early stages. Freud, who lived around about 100 years ago now, acknowledged fully the conscious, the subconscious, the unconscious mind. So he knew, and for the first time in history, was able to break down 3 aspects of consciousness. Rather than just saying there is consciousness, he said, yeah, there is consciousness, but there's 3 levels of this, right, to help us better understand ourselves. And Freud gave us a great foundation. Granted, he gave us some pretty abstract ideas to consider as well, spent a lot of time talking about sex, sexuality, dreams, the libido, all these sorts of things that are irrelevant for modern applied psychologists, but he did point us in a direction to look to better understand ourselves if we're coming from more a Kierkegaard perspective, right, know thyself, for the purpose of flourishing in life. If we want to be virtuous, we must know ourselves. If we want to know ourselves, we've got to look deeper within and become acquainted with our unconscious. So the Freudian psychoanalytical perspective allows us to revisit our pasts, to understand how it is that we may have interpreted our pasts and how that, therefore, is impacting our present day behaviour. Interesting ideas. We will explore all of this soon. So we then move on, evolve into the cognitive perspective, which focuses more on thoughts, right? Just the mind. How the quality of our thinking, our perceptions, our interpretations of our life experiences will impact our emotional experience. How then our emotional experience will determine, if not govern, our actions and habits and behaviours, which then determines the outcomes that we go on to experience. So what the cognitive school of thought builds upon, the Freudian perspective, the psychoanalytical perspective, also builds upon behaviorism, evolutionary theory, and developmental psychology to unpack and give us even more insight into the human experience, showing the connection between behaviours, emotions, and thoughts. Definitely a psychological perspective. From here, we want to explore humanism. This one school of thought focuses solely on the human experience, what drives our behaviour, what motivates us, what operates at the core, why we do the things that we do. So it does take a slightly more philosophical, reflective approach, but gives us frameworks and a basis through which and upon which we can reflect upon to better understand ourselves. From here, we are then going to look at the person-centred approach that I've mentioned, because we're all responding to people, right? Our interpretations of life, the beliefs that we've developed have all come about in response to the interactions and the relationships that we've had with people and things at some point in the past. Freud fully acknowledged this, gives us this depth of understanding. We want to therefore then look at how it is that we relate more effectively to people, if we're even willing to consider that the quality of our lives is going to be heavily influenced by the quality of the relationships we keep. Is there any greater purpose in life than connecting meaningfully with other people? Some people might say, I want the money, I want the stuff, I want the castles, I want the cars, I want the rest of it. But I guess if all of that stuff comes at the cost of the connections that we have with other people, well, how meaningful then is all this stuff? These are questions that as modern applied psychologists we want to ask and be able to authentically answer. Because all of this, apart from the biological school, it focuses on the part that cognition, our interpretation, what our drivers, our motives play on determining and governing our behaviour. But this is all intrinsic, all right? The brain, opposite, kind of functions far left, if you like. The human brain is the human brain, the human mind is the human mind, but then we need to explore and at least acknowledge how it is that human behaviour can be influenced by society at large. So there's going to be our interpretation of life and our interpretation of our experience that will influence our behaviour to some degree, but our interpretation of life and our experiences are often and very, very frequently, sometimes going to be determined by our interpretation of how we're being perceived on a social level, right? So we want to look at the socio-cultural perspective and just see if we can identify what role society might play in governing and determining or influencing human behaviour also.